Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 88, The Teutonic Knights versus Lithuania. Once again, I would like to thank Tsar Mohaned for his generous Patreon support, and everyone else who has subscribed through any platform and supported this podcast. As we heard a couple of episodes ago, early Lithuania was an expansionist power, but the object of its desires was the Rus Kняжество to its south and east. It did not seek the Order's lands in either Prussia or Livonia. But the wedge of Samogitia continued to point to the Baltic coast, splitting the Order's two main territories, and therefore Lithuania continued to be the focus of the Order's aggression. Over the course of the 14th century, the Order will mount more than 300 campaigns against the Grand Duchy. This period of essentially unrelenting campaigns running from 1283 to 1422 is often called the Lithuanian Crusade. The Order's primary target was Samogitia, 20,000 square kilometers of territory that would enable it to create a contiguous Ordenstadt and take total control of the Baltic coast, and therefore trade. But the Order framed it as a holy war against Europe's last pagan stronghold, as driven by its papal mandates for conversion, and as defending Christendom against pagan barbarians and Eastern schismatics. The crusade began as raids, known as Raisen from the Middle High German. There was no provocation. The Order decided to mount the campaigns as soon as it had completed the suppression of Prussia, and historians agree that the Order is at fault in the century of warfare. In 1283, a raid on Bicene near Kaunas took 2,000 prisoners who were sold into slavery. The slave raiding, accompanied by burning of villages, became an annual event. Traidinis and Butigeidis reacted with guerrilla ambushes in the Samogitian forest and retaliatory raids into Prussia, which did not have any deterrent effect on the knights. The Samogitians proved to be highly competent at applying hit-and-run tactics with small bands in the forest, turning the conflict into constant attrition. The raids intensified during Wittdenis's reign. Grand Master Siegfried von Volkswagen moved the Order's headquarters to Marienburg to improve logistics for the Raisen and intensified efforts to take Samogitia. In the 1305 campaign, 12 Samogitian villages were burned and 4,000 peasants enslaved. An attempt was made to establish a permanent foothold in the Dubisa Valley, but it failed due to flooding. Neither side was able to make a breakthrough. A Sambian incursion caused heavy losses, but at other times Samogitian nobles defected, lured by German promises, and when the knights could pin their enemies down, they often won. The Lithuanian raids were used as justification for further campaigns and to attract new recruits. The establishment of Prussia and Livonia as Order territories had marked the conclusion of the Order's initial crusade, And, as noted, the campaigns against the Lithuanians were seen by the order as a new crusade. Some historians have argued that they were not, in fact, a crusade, but more like chivalric adventure holidays for Europe's knights. But I think that those who argue that they were crusades have the stronger case. The early 14th century actually saw an increase in foreign knights in the Baltic after they'd been missing for a few decades. Knights came to join the campaigns from England, the Netherlands, France, northern and southern Italy, and Scotland. Later in the 14th century, they were joined by knights from Spain and Poland. Some of you might be familiar with the knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who had fought against the Turks in the Levant, Muslims in Spain and North Africa, and Lithuanians in the Baltic, showing that the Crusader spheres were linked in the popular consciousness. The Northern Crusades were particularly popular with the English, especially during lulls in the 100 Years' War. English crusaders continued to make their way to the Baltic, even at the height of the Black Death, and for most of the 14th century, the English crown paid the order an annual pension. Henry, Duke of Lancaster, took 400 men to the Baltic in 1351. His grandson, the future Henry IV of England, went twice, spending most of his time laying siege to Vilnius. As attempts to carry on crusades in the Mediterranean faltered following the loss of Acre, the northeastern frontier of Latin Christendom became the leading destination for crusaders, and a key opportunity for knights to earn a reputation. The order also continued to use the papal indulgences granted for crusaders, as well as those that were similar to the ones used in the Levant. The order had special indulgences for fighting the pagans that were only used in the Baltic. The Reisen were organized around days associated with the Virgin Mary. February the 2nd, the Feast of Our Lady of the Candles, 15th of August, the Feast of the Assumption, and 8th of September, the birthday of the Virgin, were common days for starting campaigns. The order's armies marched under a banner bearing the image of Mary, and men that came to fight alongside them were referred to as cruciferi, crusaders. People that accompanied them without taking part in the fighting were called peregrini, pilgrims. The primary route was across the eastern border of Prussia, although sometimes the knights would go from Livonia if the weather conditions were less conducive. Livonia only rarely directly participated in the campaigns against Samogitia. Their focus was on Pskov. The order's writings increasingly refer to the Orthodox as schismatics that should not be treated as true Christians. Orthodox that fought alongside pagans, as the Pskovians did with the Lithuanians, were regarded as lower than the pagans themselves. The frontier was taking form as the frontier of true Christendom. As is usually the case, this led to a reaction from the Orthodox. The anti-Catholic worldview and conceptualization of the Western Church as an existential threat to Orthodox Rus, which we discussed back in the Alexander Nevsky episodes, emerged in Pskov around this time and spread to the other kняжества from there. The order called the land they were trying to take the große Wildnis, the Great Wilderness. The term drew on biblical imagery to depict the frontier as a physical and spiritual desert. It also reflected the ongoing effects of the Order's unrelenting aggression. As had already happened in Prussia and Livonia, where the knights did not slaughter the local population, they made it impossible for them to continue living in their homes. Southwestern Lithuania was depopulated and would not be resettled until the 16th century. The Prussian frontier was marked by a chain of castles and fortresses. The constant conflict made life here precarious, and civilian settlements did not develop around them until decades later. This isolation left the Order's border regions without local crafts and manufacturing, or their own food resources. Everything had to be brought in. The archaeological record shows the fortresses being built, destroyed by Lithuanian reprisals, and rebuilt again and again. The Racen had to assemble and start from the relative safety of Königsberg. By the end of the 14th century, the Order was forced to build its castles on islands for additional protection. These factors, combined with the usual concerns in swampy territory, meant that campaigning was limited to the winter, when the frozen ground and rivers enabled the armies to move with relative freedom. In the summer, the Order would use the rivers to bring supplies up to base camps, but once an army crossed the border, it could not be resupplied. Occasionally, the Order would agree a peace with the Lithuanians, as they did with Gediminas. These periods did not last long. At other times, the German Emperor Louis IV, for example, would issue an order granting the whole of Samogitia and Lithuania to the Order. The assigning of rights to land they did not possess only provided new grounds for conflict. In the second half of the 14th century, the Order escalated its attacks on Lithuania, which provoked a corresponding escalation in Lithuanian attacks on Prussia. Eventually, Lithuania returned to the same conclusion that Mindaugas had had a century earlier. To deal with the knights, they would need to convert to Christianity and place Lithuania under papal protection. In 1386, Jorgaila was baptized, but this made no difference. The Order actually increased its attacks on Lithuania. When a civil war developed in Lithuania around the union with Poland, the Order joined in on the side of Jorgaila's cousin, Vytautas, who was trying to keep Lithuania separate. The number of English and French knights travelling to participate in the Crusade actually peaked in the 1390s, well after the Lithuanians had converted to Christianity. At the siege of Vilnius, the future Henry IV was rounding up Lithuanian prisoners and delivering them to the priest to be baptized, although they told him that they had already been baptized. When challenged as to why they were continuing to fight against the Christianized Lithuanians and Poles who had converted 3 centuries earlier, the Order accused the Lithuanians of sham conversions and declared that the Poles were enemies of the Church for helping them. Gradually, though, the foreign crusaders began to have misgivings. When England's war with France restarted under Henry V, they stopped coming. But it would take until 1414 for a formal challenge to be brought against the Order's crusade at the Council of Constance. The Order presented the same arguments that it had been making for decades. Lithuanian conversion was a sham, and any Christian who aided pagans was a valid target. The Polish delegation was headed by Paweł Włodkowicz, the rector of the Krakow Academy, Poland's oldest university and a staunch advocate for religious tolerance. Their main argument was that the order had no legal basis for its war. Their intended occupation of Samogitia was unjust, and the forced conversion of pagans and Orthodox was not effective. Newly converted witnesses from Samogitia were brought in to testify that the Lithuanian-Polish Union was doing a better job of converting the locals. Both sides presented themselves as the true defenders of Catholicism against the threat of pagans and Orthodox schismatics. Pope Martin V fudged the judgment. He took no action against the order for the decades they had spent killing Catholics, but he made Poland and Lithuania responsible for missionary work in the Baltic. In 1422, a final contingent of German knights set out for the Baltic, intending to take part in a racer. They arrived in Königsberg just as a peace treaty was signed, in which the order formally renounced its claims to Samogitia, and the border between Prussia and Lithuania was officially demarcated. In the period from Mindaugas to Gediminas, the continuous attacks from the Teutonic Knights isolated Lithuania and cut it off from trade. Fighting was a constant drain on revenue, while the depopulation of the regions that were being fought over reduced the opportunities for both loot and raising funds for protecting populations. This actually increased Christian contacts in the main part of Lithuania. Christian settlers were allowed in to boost local craft production and make up for lost trade. They brought new techniques and ways of organizing their work. The Franciscans were invited to establish themselves. This was not intended to be for missionary purposes, but rather to use the Franciscans' network to improve contacts with the West and work against the order. We've already seen the Mongols using them for a similar purpose. The emergent Lithuania had been fragile. The dukes were local leaders associated by personal relationships rather than any formal legal ties. As we heard a couple of episodes ago, it was characterized by instability and frequent changes in leadership. Under pressure from the order, this is changing by the time of Gediminas. The reversion to paganism provides an initial cause for unification against their Christian enemies, and ruling privileges are quite quickly codified and formalized. Gediminas will divide Lithuania into hereditary duchies and fiefs. This contributes to the formation of a class of nobility that organizes the military and taxes, while developing loyalty to the dynasty that grants them their privileges. The appearance of hereditary rights enables the development of a manor economy. That is something along the lines of what we usually think of as medieval feudalism. Local landowning lords forming the center of a self-sufficient agricultural community in which peasants work the land in exchange for protection and the right to use some land for their own needs. At the same time, the arrival of immigrants and the development of local crafts and artisans led to increased urbanization, although the cities and towns remained small, under 10,000 residents. Local metalworking and pottery centers appeared, but despite these changes, Lithuania remained in a Malthusian trap. That is, any increase in resources led to an increase in population, which then put pressure on resources, pushing living standards back down to subsistence. Average life expectancy remained below 25 years. Before Mindaugas, the Lithuanians had only fought as tribal levies, relying on using the terrain, as the knights were clearly better equipped and better trained. The late 13th century saw moves to create centralized leadership. Traidenis appointed the first commanders, and castle building led to the appearance of garrisons, which could undergo training, and stud farms, which meant better quality cavalry. The Lithuanian army shifted from being primarily infantry to being mainly cavalry. They quickly copied the Order's use of crossbows and siege techniques. By the time of Vytenis, the improvements in organization meant that Lithuanians could sustain full campaigns, coordinating multiple forces. As a result, the role of dukes moved more to protecting their own lands or the borders, while a professional command was formed from the nobility. The development of Lithuania also impacted the neighbouring Rus Kняжества. The order had made some early progress against the Rus, with Bishop Albert taking Polotsk's tributaries early in the 13th century. After the arrival of the Mongols, Lithuania was becoming able to counter the order and expand into the Kняжества, which were weakened by the invasion, even as Lithuania grew in strength. Mindaugas took Black Rus and brought Polotsk under Lithuanian influence. By Gediminas' accession, Polotsk had been annexed. Gediminas will add Brest and Podlachia. Volhynia, Chernihiv, and Kiev will follow. The Rurikid rulers of these Kняжества will be replaced with Gediminids, and further resources will be brought into Lithuania's war with the Order. As history fans, I am sure that many of you will have thought about how empire and imperialism have meant different things over time, and how we treat them in different ways. We see modern European colonial empires as something different to Roman or Persian empires, or other non-European empires from the age before the nation-state and the racialization of international relations. You may have given thought to how and when this changed. European colonization of the Americas, with the massive loss of indigenous populations and millions of enslaved people imported from Africa, seems clearly different to, say, Charlemagne, especially in how they justified their conquests. But was this due to a sudden shift in how Europeans thought about conquest and expansion? In recent years, scholars have been looking for the roots of modern imperialism earlier, finding the same tropes and justifications that will appear later in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, in places like the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. The Baltic Crusades are often overlooked, but I think we can see a precursor of later colonialism developing quite clearly here in the north. The Teutonic Order's campaigns in the Prussian and then the Lithuanian Crusades explicitly displayed the characteristics of what we would later call settler colonialism. There was the systematic depopulation of indigenous lands through warfare to create a wilderness. There was a rhetorical framing of the depopulated land as terra nullius, empty land, to justify its seizure and settlement. There was the demographic replacement of the native population with imported settlers. There was the ideological dehumanization of the native peoples in order to legitimize violence. And when one pretext failed, like paganism, they shifted justifications to carry on their conquest. The Order's great wilderness was not an untouched primeval void. It was systematically and deliberately depopulated through decades of warfare, and this was entirely conscious. The Order's chroniclers, such as Peter von Duisburg, stated that the land was not a desertum or solitudinem, desert or wilderness, because it was empty, but because the pagan population was misusing it. The Lithuanians' sacred groves were held up as evidence of their inability to use land rationally. The relentless raids were intended to terrorize the population, strip the land of sustenance, and turn it into an unlivable buffer zone. And they succeeded. The land was returned to wilderness. Europe's last wild aurochs roamed through the territory from which agriculture had been eliminated. And once this was done, the Order declared the empty land was theirs. Administrative lines were drawn on maps. Land and legal privileges were conferred on the German-speaking settlers, eradicating all traces of previous indigenous land use. Peter von Duisburg described the Order's actions towards the native population as exterminaverunt. They exterminated. Between 50 and 70% of the old Prussian population was slaughtered or starved. In Samogitia, losses were lower as it was easier to flee to Lithuania, but the aim was the same. New settlers were then actively recruited from Germany and given a privileged place with a clear hierarchy in which the settlers were over the surviving locals, until they were eventually assimilated out of existence. The Order's chroniclers described the Lithuanians as vipers, who knew the truth of Christianity but had chosen to reject it, deliberate enemies of the faith who could only be destroyed. The chronicles refer to the Lithuanian people as sheep or rabbits, who needed to be culled to enable the land to prosper. When the conversion of Jorgaila and union with Christian Poland made this framing untenable, the Order immediately shifted to calling the conversion a political sham and claiming the Lithuanians were false Christians. This all seems very similar to later imperial tropes about native populations incapable of true civilization, and therefore needing to be subjugated and ruled. Once Lithuania had adopted Christianity, the war could not be justified as a crusade, but the Order continued it for decades as a political project. The Order's propaganda also was similar to classic imperialist tropes. Although Lithuanian women were not exoticized, they were treated as victims of Lithuanian men, passive property to be taken as plunder, whose lot would immediately be improved by capture. As we find in later imperialism, Lithuanian men were disparaged as lacking humanity, virility, and manly virtues. When the Lithuanians win, they are bestial and savage, not brave. When they lose, they are cowards. The chroniclers particularly highlighted cases of warriors committing suicide to avoid capture as evidence that they were lesser men, unfit to rule themselves. So, although the Teutonic Order's campaigns were feudal and theocratic, rather than capitalist and racial, I think we can see that in many aspects it was a forerunner of future European imperialisms. The Order will eventually lose its wars, but the issues created by German settlement will echo down the centuries until the massive ethnic cleansing of the 20th century. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.